Would you dare open the door, knowing that outside is a giant Bigfoot cradling its dying child in its arms? In the heart of a snowstorm, deep within the forests of Upper Michigan, a 72-year-old woman named Marian opened her cabin door and found herself staring into the exhausted eyes of a creature no one truly believes exists. It wasn't growling. It wasn't threatening. It was a mother, desperate, shivering, and holding a feverish child close to its chest. This isn't a story about monsters. It's a story about compassion, about what happens when someone chooses love over fear. Marian didn't run. She didn't scream. She gave warmth, care, and the last piece of her wedding quilt to a being the world would call a myth. And in return, the Bigfoot, who Marian called Maura, gave back something far more powerful: trust. But how far can a story like this reach? Could it warm hearts across oceans, or spark hope in someone watching from a small town or a busy city? So tell me, where are you watching this from? What's your name, dear viewer? Maybe this story found you for a reason. If it touched something in you, I'd be honored if you gave it a like, shared it with someone who still believes in kindness, and joined our growing community of Bigfoot believers by subscribing. Together, let's keep the warmth alive, one story at a time. Marian Weller didn't believe in superstition. Not in ghosts, not in omens, not in things that creaked outside a window past midnight. She believed in gauze, boiled water, the quiet steadiness of a pulse. But that morning, standing barefoot on the tin roof of her cabin with a hammer in one hand and a patch of shingles in the other, she felt something shift, not inside her, but in the air. Something like a hush, too long to be just wind, too sudden to be a trick of the trees. Her roof had leaked again. It always did after the snow melt. The nail head popped from the timber like a tooth from tired gums, and the spring rains found their way through. She muttered under her breath and pressed her knee against the last board. At 63, Marian still moved with the quiet resolve of someone who knew where every bone in her body ached, but never asked for pity. A retired midwife doesn't retire from the weather or from doing what needs done. She paused, holding the new piece of shingle against the roofline. Just for a second, because she heard it. A sound. Footsteps. Too slow for deer, too even for squirrel. 4 distinct presses on forest floor. And then, nothing. No rustle, no echo. Just a silence so complete, it felt deliberate. She didn't look up. She didn't turn. Just kept hammering until the last nail sank flush. Down below, the stovepipe coughed once, and then went dead. The warmth that had gathered all morning in the cabin faded like someone had lifted the heat out with 2 giant hands. She climbed down slowly, her joints stiff from cold. Opened the firebox and checked for blockage. Nothing. The coals were still red. No damp wood, no sudden wind. Just a fire that had stopped. She didn't say a word. Later, when the girl came, Marian didn't bring it up. She didn't mention the steps, or the silence, or the way the fire had gone out like a snuffed candle. She just opened the door to Tessa Wynne and the 2 muslin sacks she dragged in behind her. Tessa's cheeks were windburned. Her boots caked with mud from the thaw. "I brought flour," she said. "And salt. You still got jars." Marian gestured to the kitchen with her chin. "On the shelf." Tessa hovered near the door like she didn't trust the warmth inside to be real. She wasn't from the woods. Not really, but she came around, every week or so, trading small things, asking questions she pretended not to care about. She squinted at the stove. "It's cold in here." "Fire went out," Marian said simply. Tessa dropped her bags and rubbed her arms. "You want me to relight it?" "No." The girl looked around, restless. Her eyes bounced over the shelves lined with canning jars, the strings of dried herbs near the window. The long wooden beam where Marian carved a line for everyday winter hadn't killed her. "Did you hear about the swamp?" Tessa asked. Marian didn't answer. She was peeling a root, slicing it with the careful rhythm of someone who could measure pain by sound. Big prints, the girl continued. Real big. Eddie saw them near the waterline. Said it looked like a barefoot man, but not. Marian placed the root into a jar and poured vinegar over it. Tessa leaned closer. You think it's true? There's things in the woods that don't ask for our opinion, Marian said. Tessa shifted her weight. People laugh when I bring it up. They say I want attention, but I wasn't even the one who saw it. You don't need to be seen to matter, Marian said. You don't need to be believed either. That quieted the girl for a moment. She turned to the window. Outside, the sky was gray as ash, and the edge of the woods looked deeper than usual. How do you know if something's watching? Tessa asked, almost like a joke. You don't listen with your ears, Marian replied. You listen with how everything else goes still. Tessa nodded, but her mouth said she wasn't convinced. She stayed for tea, barely touched her cup, and then said she had to get home before dark. She grabbed her sacks and gave the stove one last glance before slipping out the door. By nightfall, the fire was strong again. Marian sat in her worn chair, the one with the cushion flattened to her shape. She held a small quilt in her lap, not for warmth, but for the weight of it, for the memory sewn into every square. Then came the second silence. No breeze, no creak, just a stillness so loud it made her heart beat faster. At the threshold, right there, on the wooden step where boots scraped off snow and dogs sometimes waited, lay a bundle. Not trash, not accident. A neat coil of dried grasses and thin moss, braided tight like a tourniquet. It sat there with purpose. No note, no decoration, no scent of animal. She bent down slowly, picked it up, turned it over in her palm. It wasn't decoration. It was something else. Something made with care. Something meant to be understood. She brought it inside and held it under the oil lamp. The braiding was rough but deliberate. At the very center, almost woven in, was a single red thread, thinner than floss, barely visible against the gold and green. Marian's breath caught. She knew that thread. She knew its exact hue. 12 years ago, she'd unraveled a fraying sleeve from a red wool sweater and used that same yarn to repair a baby's hat. She'd kept the scrap in her sewing tin. No one else could have had it. No one living, at least. She opened her cabinet, pulled the tin, dug through thimbles and pins until she found the corner of a red. Identical. She didn't cry. Marian hadn't cried in years. Not since that night in 1981 when a snowstorm blocked the only road to the clinic and a baby died in her arms before help arrived. But her hands shook. She wrapped the bundle in a dishcloth and left it on the table. She didn't burn it, didn't bury it. Just let it sit there, like a question without an answer. In the morning, the snow had crusted to a thin layer. She stepped outside with a tin pail, boots crunching lightly. The air was colder than it should have been. As she knelt near the firewood stack, her eyes caught it, just beyond the step. A line. No, a drag. The snow had been scraped clean in a long, deliberate path, not like a deer's stumble or a fox's trail. This was low, heavy. Something pulled, not carried. And the strangest part, it hugged the tree line. Not down the path, not over open land, but right along the edge, where shadow and bark blurred the shape of anything moving. She followed it a few paces, then stopped. She wasn't chasing, just noting. The kind of noting you do when your bones already know the answer. She walked back to the cabin and stood at the step where the bundle had been. Kneeling, she placed it exactly where she found it. An offering returned. She didn't speak aloud. Not yet. But her breath did something strange when it left her lips. It didn't drift. It hung in place, like waiting. Later that day, Tessa returned for the jars she forgot. She saw Marian at the edge of the porch, staring into the trees. "You okay?" the girl asked. Marian didn't turn. Tessa stepped closer. "You look like you're expecting something." "I'm not afraid," Marian said. "Just paying attention." The girl followed her gaze but saw nothing. That night the wind howled once, then died, and stillness returned. Not quiet, not peace. A pause, like the woods were holding its breath again. Marian lay in bed, the quilt over her chest, The fire cracked down to embers. She closed her eyes, then opened them again. Her hand drifted toward the table, toward the empty place where the bundle had been, and she whispered low, to no one, "If someone's hurt out there, don't die alone." She didn't expect an answer. But sometimes, in a place where silence is sacred, it's not about being heard. It's about what hears you. The air had turned thick. Not hot, not yet, but heavy in that way June sometimes brought. Like the forest was inhaling and hadn't decided yet whether to exhale into storm or sun. Mosquitoes drifted under the eaves like thoughts that wouldn't leave. Marian stood beside her raised garden bed, hands deep in soil still cool from the night. She pulled weeds with a rhythm that felt older than memory and stacked mint stems into neat little bundles on the porch rail to dry. All morning the clouds flirted with shadows, but no rain came. A sharp cry carried from the ravine near the creek. Short, desperate, not human. She straightened slowly, eyes narrowing as her fingers brushed the handle of the pail hanging from a fence post. One sound, then silence. She followed the slope where the forest dipped into a shallow trench of water and brambles. The smell of damp leaves and old mud rose to meet her. There, twisted in panic, legs bent beneath it in a cruel angle, was a fawn. Its chest heaved like bellows. Tiny hooves scraped at the muddy wall, trying to climb out, but it was stuck, panicked, alone. Marian didn't speak. She set down the pail and pulled a coil of rope from around her shoulder, a habit left over from years of hauling supplies or clotheslines, now pressed into emergency service. She braced her boots, looped the rope behind the animal's chest, and with slow, determined pulls, began to lift. The fawn kicked weakly, but she didn't flinch. She pulled the way she'd once helped deliver breech twins in a snowbound cabin outside Iron Mountain. Steady, quiet, without giving fear room to grow. When it came loose, the fawn stumbled, staggered, and then took off through the trees, not once looking back. Just vanished, like a ghost born of grass and water. Tessa had been watching from halfway down the hill. She hadn't meant to. Just came early, as she sometimes did, hoping for a sandwich, or maybe just someone to talk to without being laughed at. Her eyes tracked the fawn until it disappeared. "You think it knows you saved it?" she asked. Marian brushed her hands off and didn't answer at first. She walked past the girl, picked up her pail, and started back toward the cabin. Over her shoulder, she said, "Doesn't matter." Inside, the oil lamp flickered as Tessa kicked off her boots. She tried to laugh. "You're kinda like a forest witch, you know that." Marian set down the pail. "You hungry?" Tessa shrugged. "Always." They ate soup with boiled potatoes and bits of squirrel meat, the kind Marian dried and stored for months ahead. Tessa dipped bread in hers and picked out every tiny bone. Her mouth said she didn't care, but her eyes kept drifting to the fireplace. The braided bundle that had appeared a week ago still rested on the table, wrapped now in linen and tucked behind a mason jar of dried rose hips. "You still have that thing?" she asked. Marian didn't look up. It wasn't trash. The girl's fingers drummed against the bowl. Could have been a prank, kids from town, or something a bird dragged in. It wasn't. Outside, the wind hissed through pine. The cabin didn't creak. It listened. That afternoon, Marian handed Tessa a hatchet and pointed toward the wood pile. "Split that," the girl groaned. "I don't even chop wood for my own house." "That's why you're soft." "I'm not soft." Marian didn't reply, just walked toward the garden again. Later, they cleaned jars, rinsed them in hot water, dried them on flour sacks until the glass shone like bone under candlelight. Tessa helped mash berries with a wooden spoon. Juice stained her fingers red, and she wiped it on her shirt like it didn't matter. They went foraging out past the clearing, stopping only at the edge where the moss grew darker and the shadows lengthened even at noon. Marian held up her hand when Tessa wandered too far. "Not there." "Why not? There's berries." "There's other things too." Tessa huffed but stayed close. Then, just past a bend in the ridge, she saw it. 2 branches, curved like antlers, tied with vines into an arch barely 3 feet tall. Around the base, old bones. Tiny, like from birds or raccoons maybe. Some bleached, some painted with ash. It wasn't a shrine. It wasn't a joke. It was a gate, or a warning. "What the hell?" she whispered. Marian's voice was low. "Don't touch it. Is this a trap or something?" "No." "Then what?" "There are paths that aren't meant for us. This is one." Tessa stared at the twisted bones. The way the sticks were bent so carefully. It felt like language. Like someone had arranged a sentence she didn't speak, but still understood. They turned back, but Tessa's fingers had already moved. Quick, impulsive. She pocketed a small sliver of bone at the base. Just one piece. Not much bigger than her thumb. She didn't tell Marian. She didn't even know why she took it. Maybe to prove to herself it wasn't real. Maybe to hold something that had once felt like power. That night, Dale Mercer showed up at the general store with new boots and the kind of grin that made people shift sideways. He bought steel traps, jerky, and asked too many questions. "You heard about them tracks out by the swamp?" he said to the cashier. "Might be a big cat, or something else." He tapped the counter with one thick knuckle. "I got someone offering real money if I bring back proof." No one took him seriously, but they didn't laugh either. At midnight, Tessa woke to a sound outside her trailer. Heavy, measured, like someone testing each plank of the porch with slow, aching patience. She froze in bed. Breath caught behind her teeth. She reached under her pillow, found the bone piece she'd hidden there, and clutched it. The steps stopped. Then came silence. Morning light revealed nothing. No prints, no marks, just dust and the memory of dread. She rode her bike to Marian's, barely speaking. She pulled the bone from her pocket and dropped it on the kitchen table. "I took it." Marian stared. "I didn't think it mattered." "You need to put it back." Tessa's voice cracked. "I didn't mean to." "It doesn't matter what you meant." They walked back. No jokes this time. No picking berries or swatting flies. The woods felt too quiet. Not dangerous, just watchful. At the gate, Marian knelt, took the bone from Tessa's hand and placed it gently where it belonged. For a moment, everything held still. The wind, the birds, even the sun. Then, very faintly, something moved. Far beyond the trees, in that gap where the light shifted between trunks, Marian saw it. Not a threat, not a beast. A figure. Massive, but not hulking. Covered in thick dark fur, with a smaller shape cradled to its chest. The outline of a shoulder, the curve of a limb, the dip of a shaggy head resting protectively over something tiny. A mother and her child. Marian didn't speak. She didn't blink. Tessa turned. "What is it?" "Nothing," Marian said. "It's gone now." Back in town, Dale bought another trap, one heavier. He cornered the store clerk and asked again, "That woman, the one who lives way out there, still around?" The clerk shrugged. "Marian? Yeah, why?" Dale grinned. "Just curious. Heard she's got a habit of knowing things." Tessa overheard. She didn't interrupt, didn't challenge, just watched him. Watched the way he folded up the receipt like it was a map to something buried, something dangerous. That night, she sat on Marian's porch, staring out at the dark tree line. She didn't ask questions, didn't try to explain what she'd seen or what she hadn't. Marian brought her a blanket and poured warm cider into 2 cups. "Do you think it remembers me?" Tessa asked finally. "Maybe," Marian said. They sat without speaking after that. The porch creaked once in the breeze. The oil lamp flickered. Somewhere far off, a whip-poor-will called once, then stopped. And the forest, for now, let them be. The cold didn't ask permission that year. It just came, quiet at first, crawling in under the door jambs, soft as dust, then lingering like a question no one wanted to answer. By the time the birch leaves turned from yellow to rust, Marian was already layering blankets at the base of the door and checking her stores twice a week. The jars of jam had lost their shine. Everything felt duller, slower, except the sky. The sky stayed painfully bright, as if daring the ground to give up before winter really began. She moved through the cabin like someone who'd already been snowed in, her steps careful, shoulders drawn in against the draft that seemed to curl from the corners, no matter how much she sealed them. That morning, as she stepped outside to gather fallen branches, her boots sunk slightly into the sloped path behind the cabin, and she paused, not because of the depth, but because of the color, a patch of dark, not wet from rain, something else. She crouched, steadying herself with one hand on the moss-slick stump near the porch. There it was, thin, reddish-brown streaks smeared across chilled mud. Not fresh, but recent. Still bright enough to catch the eye. A trail, narrow, deliberate. And beside it, a tuft of something tangled in the grass. She lifted it gently. Dark fur, coarse, but not from a deer or bear. It had weight. Scent. Faintly earthy, like bark soaked too long in spring water. She didn't say a word. Didn't call it anything. Just folded it inside the worn handkerchief in her coat pocket and followed the drag marks a few paces further. There, under the tall firs where light didn't reach by noon, she found the broken trap. Steel jaws sprung wide, bent at the hinge. Not shattered, not ripped. Bent. Like someone, something, had pried it open with a force that understood exactly where to pull. The chain, once staked deep into the root, had been yanked loose and twisted into a knot. It wasn't brute strength, it was control. Marian stood still long enough to feel the cold settle into her knees. Then she turned back toward the cabin, her breath tight in her chest. She didn't need to see the creature again. The knowledge was already there, blooming slowly behind her ribs. Something had been hurt. Something small. And something else. Something bigger, stronger, deliberate, had come for it. Later that day, the knock came soft. Just 2 taps. Deputy Calvin Rourke. He stood on the porch in his fall jacket, boots muddy, collar turned up like the wind didn't care what badge he wore. "Checking on folks," he said, stepping inside. "Storm's moving east. You set for winter?" "I've lived through worse," Marian said, pouring water into the kettle without asking if he wanted some. She handed him the chipped mug with the faded blue ring around the rim, the one she always gave him, the one that meant she didn't plan to ask him to leave soon. He warmed his hands against it. "I've been hearing talk," he said. "Up by the old logging trails. Empty traps. Some broken clean, like wire cutters, but stronger, more precise." Marian didn't blink. "They're saying it's just bears," he added. "But bears don't cut clean. Bears don't know how to find the latch." She finally looked at him. "You don't believe it's bears?" "I don't know what I believe." She watched the steam curl between them. "Do you remember the winter of '82? He nodded slowly. "Hardest freeze in a decade." "You were what, 13? 14, he said. "Why?" "There was a report that winter," she said. "A boy fell through the ice on Mirror Lake. Said he was pulled out by something he never saw." Rourke didn't answer right away. "It's always been a rumor," she said softly. "But I remember the article. It never named the boy." He looked down into his mug. His hand trembled just slightly. "I couldn't breathe," he murmured. "Thought I was dying. And then, I wasn't." He didn't explain, didn't need to. Marian reached over and placed her hand briefly on the edge of the table, not touching him, just anchoring. "You're alive," she said. "That means something. Don't waste it chasing explanations that only matter to men who want to profit from fear." They sat in silence a little longer. "I've seen Dale Mercer sniffing around," she said finally. "Asking about the woods, the cabins. He's not just hunting game." "I'll keep an eye out." "You need to do more than that." "I'm not the law out there, Marian." "Then be something better." By the time he left, the wind had picked up again, and Marian was already preparing. She opened the drawer under the stairs. pulled out the old nurse's kit, metal tins, clean cloth, alcohol that smelled sharp and sterile, even through the cork. She checked the gauze, the needles. Everything was still there, still usable, still waiting. That night, the sky bruised deep purple. The wind yanked at the windows like a child begging to be let in. Tessa arrived just before dark, dragging a bag of potatoes and half a loaf of bread. She set them on the table without a word, eyes scanning the room. "Is it true Dale's asking about you?" she finally asked. Marian nodded. "Why?" "Because he doesn't understand what's out there, and he wants to." Tessa shifted from foot to foot. "He was at the feed store. Said something about setting traps where the real prize roams. He thinks people owe him something for what he can catch." Marian tightened her lips. "What else?" "He asked about cabins, if anyone lives alone out here, like he's hunting more than animals." "He is." Tessa swallowed. "You think he's dangerous?" "I think he's certain. And certainty like that gets things killed." The wind slammed something outside. Marian moved quickly, checking the latch, drawing the thick curtain she'd hung just 2 days before. Not to keep out the cold, but to keep out eyes. Tessa helped her light the lamp, watched her fill the kettle and slice a piece of hard cheese into smaller pieces. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked. Marian paused. "Because I owe something." "To who?" "To what's been kind, even when it didn't have to be." That night, Marian walked the tree line with a lantern. The cold bit deep. Her breath came sharp. She scanned the muddy edge where pine needles piled thick over old roots. There, hidden beneath fallen oak leaves, she saw it. A streak in the dirt. Not fresh, but clear. Like something had been dragged, gently but in haste. A body, maybe. Light. Small. She followed the trail a few feet, then stopped when it disappeared under the brush. The leaves rustled. She waited, listened, then, soft as breath, a sound came from the darkness. Not a growl, not a cry, something in between. Wounded, small, afraid. She knelt slowly, placed the lantern on the ground, and spoke in the quietest voice she had. "If you need help," she said, "you need to come closer." But nothing moved, only the wind answered, and the cold. She left the lantern lit on the step that night. A silent offering. Inside, she unfolded the same blanket she'd used that winter when the baby hadn't made it. She placed it near the hearth, added another log to the fire, and sat in her chair without picking up her book. She didn't sleep much, but she stayed warm. The last thing she heard before drifting off wasn't the wind. It was the faint clink of metal, far off. Too precise to be a branch, too familiar not to be a warning, and too late to pretend she didn't already know what was coming next. The first snow didn't arrive with warning. It just began. Thin flakes like bits of ash, swirling across the porch rail where Marian had just set down a jar of pickled beets. By the time she noticed, the wind had already shifted, colder, less playful. The kind of wind that made you close the cellar door early and test the latches twice. She moved carefully that morning. Her right hip had stiffened since the week before, since the night she knelt too long watching the tree line, waiting for something she couldn't name. The bruise hadn't gone away. It pressed back with each step like a quiet reminder. You're not 30 anymore, not 40 either. Still, she had things to do before the deep snow came. She pulled on her old coat, the green one patched at the elbows, and carried her hammer to the shed roof. A few nails had popped, just enough to let the wind through if she didn't get to it in time. She climbed the short ladder, stepped up with more resolve than balance, and then her foot slid. The ice had formed thin, undetectable, just a sheet over the wood, not even shining. Her heel gave first, then the weight of her hip followed, and her body twisted toward the earth like a sack of feed knocked from a shelf. Her shoulder hit first, then her elbow. But it was her ribs that took the worst of it. The breath left her in a sharp, cruel burst, like someone had punched her from the inside. She lay there stunned, eyes blinking against the white now falling thicker. A sting climbed up her side. She tried to rise and couldn't. Her legs trembled, boots scraping. Her fingers clawed for something. Anything. The hammer had landed a few feet away. She rolled toward it, teeth clenched, grunting with pain. Reached, missed, reached again, and then it moved. A log, not rolling, not falling, sliding toward her. A long, rough limb of pine, thick, still barked, but steady, as if nudged. She stared at it. Not the wind, not gravity. Something had given it to her. Her hand gripped the bark and pulled. Inch by inch, she dragged herself upright, sweat stinging under her wool. Her breath burned. But she got to her knees, then her feet. Limping, groaning, she staggered to the porch, one palm scraping along the rail. She didn't turn around. Not yet. Not until she was inside, against the door, back pressed hard against the wood, shaking. She pulled off her coat and saw the dark blooming beneath her sweater. Blood vessels angry. Not broken, but bruised bad. Still, it wasn't the fall that left her rattled. It was the way that log had come to her, like a hand had passed it, like help that didn't ask for thanks. That night she didn't light the lamp. She sat near the stove, watching the flames rise and fall. And when Tessa arrived the next morning, stomping snow from her boots, her eyes went wide at the sight of Marian's bruises. "Why didn't you say something?" Marian shrugged. "I didn't feel like telling." "That's not an answer." "I didn't fall hard enough to die." Tessa paced, angry in that way young people get when they care too much, but don't know where to put it. She picked up a jar from the shelf, turned it over, set it down. Then she saw it. The little box Marian never opened. The one on the mantel. Dusty. Untouched. What's in there? Things that don't need to be kept in drawers. Tessa opened it before being told not to. Inside, folded carefully, was a tiny knit hat. Baby-sized. Red. Faded with time. She didn't ask. Marian said quietly, "He would have been 12 this winter." Tessa's voice softened. "Your grandson?" "Never got that far. He didn't make it past the first night." Tessa sat down without a word. Just stayed there. The space between them wasn't empty anymore. Later, they both heard it. A low thud, far off, then closer. Not thunder, not footsteps. A rhythm, deep and deliberate. Tessa crossed to the window and froze. "Someone's in the woods." Marian followed. Squinted. Just past the tree line, where the snow drifted low and gray against the earth, a figure moved. Broad-shouldered, tall, head covered. Not hurrying. Then it bent down, hammered something into the ground. A metal stake. Dale. Tessa's jaw clenched. "He's setting traps." "He's not hiding it anymore." They watched from the shadows of the cabin as he marked the line between forest and home. Every 10 feet, a new post, a new thread of intent. That night, Marian added wood to the fire with a different kind of urgency. Every log felt like a barrier. Every flame a vow. Tessa asked, "What if he comes this way?" Marian didn't answer. Instead, she unlatched the small cedar chest by the bed and pulled out a bundle of flannel. Inside was a thick quilt. Worn, familiar. Wedding colors faded by sun and time. Marian's hand smoothed across the stitching. She didn't say the story. Just let her fingers rest on the fabric like it still carried a heartbeat. She folded it twice, laid it near the hearth. Tessa said, "You think they'll come?" "I don't know. But if they do, they'll be cold." That night the wind howled. Not sharp, just full of weight. Marian sat up once, midnight, maybe later, because something in the air changed. A shift, not noise, not scent, but movement. The sense that something was waiting just outside. She didn't open the door. She added water to the pot on the stove, draped an extra towel near the heat, folded another blanket. Actions that didn't ask for explanation. The next day, the radio in town crackled with warnings. A storm, full week, roads likely closed. People were told to stay in. Marian stocked the shelves again. Not for herself. Every jar, Every can, every inch of dried herb was set within reach. She placed extra candles on the windowsill. She didn't know if they'd come, but if they did, they wouldn't find the door locked. That evening, the light faded fast. The snow thickened again, and just before dark, as the last glow fell behind the pines, Marian stepped out to check the woodpile. She slipped once, caught herself. Then she turned toward the trees and paused. Far off, not close yet, but clear. A sound, a cry. Not human, not animal. High, fragile, wet with breath. It didn't come again. But Marian didn't need it to. She stepped back inside and shut the door behind her. Not in fear, in readiness. Because whatever was out there, it was already on its way. The storm had no shape, no direction. It moved like breath over skin, then teeth, a whiteout. Not just snow, but weight. The kind that eats sound, swallows landmarks, turns a familiar yard into a maze of swirling white. Marian couldn't see past the porch. The world beyond the window had vanished. The fire cracked in the stove, but even its rhythm sounded small. She moved through the cabin without sound. Boots off. Scarf still damp from her earlier trip to the woodpile. She'd bolted the windows, checked the latches twice, laid extra rags along the doorframe. Everything was ready for the kind of night people told stories about. Nights where roads disappeared, power failed, and even the brave didn't go out unless something was dying. And something was. She didn't know how she knew. She just did. It wasn't a voice or a vision. It was the kind of knowing that settled in your gut and refused to let you sit still. The kind of knowing that tightened your chest when you tried to rest. The pot of water she'd left warming on the stove hadn't been for tea. The towels near the fire weren't for her hands. The folded quilt beside the hearth, the one stitched decades ago with colors she couldn't even find in stores anymore, wasn't for memory tonight. A gust hit the west wall. The lamp rattled. And then, in that vast, brutal silence that followed, it came. 3 knocks. Not frantic, not polite, just heavy, patient. Marian's hand gripped the back of the chair. She didn't flinch. Her breath steadied, slow and thin. She walked to the door, unlatched the top bolt, then the second, then the bottom. The cold leaked through before she even opened it. But the cold wasn't what made her knees buckle. It was the shape. There, silhouetted against the wall of snow, stood the one from the tree line. The mother, Maura, taller than the doorframe, covered in wet, wind-matted fur. Eyes rimmed with frost and something more raw than fear. And in her arms, limp and curled, was the smaller shape. Pip. The child didn't move, didn't lift his head, didn't cry. Marian stepped back without a word, and Maura stepped in, not fast, not pleading. Every motion calculated, gentle. Her wide shoulders shifted sideways to avoid knocking anything. Her footfalls were so light they barely stirred the dust. But it was her face, her eyes, that held Marian there. Maura knelt, slowly, like she understood what it meant, to lower herself before someone else, not out of weakness, but grace. She bowed her head, just once, and Marian felt something tear inside her. A dam, a tether, a silence that had lasted longer than she realized. She reached out, not to Maura, but to the bundle in her arms. "I need to see him," she said. Maura hesitated, then lifted Pip forward. He was burning. Skin too hot, breath shallow. His limbs twitched once, then stilled again. Marian laid her palm to his forehead, felt the damp heat. Fever, dehydration, exhaustion, maybe worse. She cleared the table with one sweep of her arm. Herbs, jars, folded linens, gone. She motioned Maura closer. "Here." Maura placed him down, fingers trembling. Marian unwrapped the child. Beneath the fur, the skin was paper-thin in places, cracks along the lips, bruising under one eye. Not from violence, from a body losing the fight. She pulled a basin of water from the stove. Not hot, just warm. Enough to draw out the heat. She dipped a cloth and began to dab, slow and circular. Neck, chest, arms. Under the fur, his rib cage rose and fell in uneven rhythm. Maura crouched beside her. Didn't move, didn't breathe too hard, just watched. Marian worked like she used to, like she hadn't in years. Like the ache in her back and the tightness in her wrist didn't matter. This wasn't about comfort. This was survival. She layered cloth, checked his pulse, tilted his head to clear the airway, tapped gently at his throat until he stirred. Not much, but enough. Then she did what she hadn't done since 1981. She reached for the wedding quilt, the one she had folded for her first child, the one that never got used because the crib stayed empty. She had kept it clean all these years, hoping she'd pass it down one day. Maybe to a niece, maybe to someone who needed warmth. But this was more than warmth. She laid it across Pip's body, folding the edges under him tight, letting only his face peek through. Maura watched the fabric as though it glowed. And maybe it did, because when Marian looked up, Maura's eyes were wet. Not sobbing, not shaking, just full. A kind of grief she couldn't show anyone else. Marian didn't reach out. She just whispered, "He's got a chance now." Pip stirred. Maura leaned closer, brushed his face with a fingertip that dwarfed his cheek. Her hand moved slow, reverent, then pulled back like she was afraid to make it worse. Marian offered water in a metal spoon. Just a drop, just enough. He swallowed. Marian nearly collapsed, but instead, she kept going, hour after hour, changing cloth, adding snow to the water basin to keep it cool, feeding tiny sips of broth by candlelight. Maura never slept. She stood near the door, always between Pip and the outside. She never sat, never turned her back. She ate only once, and only after Marian insisted. Only after Pip took his second sip without coughing. And when she did eat, it was with her head low and her hands cupped like prayer. Marian sat on the floor with her back to the stove. Her knees ached. Her feet had gone numb, but she didn't move. This wasn't about her. She looked at Maura and said softly, "You trusted me." Maura tilted her head. The muscles in her neck twitched. "I won't forget that," Marian said. Maura didn't nod, but she didn't look away. Outside, the wind shifted. The logs in the stove hissed, then popped. Marian added another, listening. Then, just past the howl, she heard it. Footsteps, far off. Then again, she froze. Maura's ears twitched. She turned toward the window. Low, fast, urgent. She moved to the curtain and pulled it back just a breath. Marian followed. Through the frost-glazed glass, a shadow moved at the tree line. Upright, wide-shouldered. Not Maura. Human. Too close. Then it stopped. Stood still, as if it were listening. Marian felt the air tighten. Maura's chest rose with a silent inhale. And in the silence that followed, a tiny sound came from the blanket. A breath. Soft. Clear. Pip. He had stirred again. Marian turned back. He was blinking slowly. His small hand curled around the edge of the quilt. A sign. She knelt beside him. Maura stayed near the window. A minute passed. Maybe more. Then a soft sound echoed outside. Metal against wood. Barely a tap, but loud in a night like this. Marian stepped toward the door. Didn't open it. She knelt. Pressed her palm to the floor. Just breathed. She looked at Maura, and Maura looked back. No words. No nod. Just understanding. The kind that only forms between mothers, or those who have lost, and those who refuse to lose again. The storm didn't lift. Not the next day. Not the day after. It settled like a verdict, burying the world beyond Marian's windows in a thickness so white it blurred the line between sky and ground. Every window pane had frosted over, every door groaned with weight. There was no leaving, no checking traps, no walks to the spring for water. There was only this cabin, this small flame of heat in the throat of winter, and everything that had found its way inside it. On the first day, Marian rationed. She'd prepared for solitude, not guests. Not 2 extra bodies, not one of them burning through fever and breath. She made mental notes while her hands worked. How much rice was left? How many strips of jerky tucked behind the jar of pepper? She counted candles, measured the stacked wood like a farmer measuring out hope. Maura didn't sit. She hovered near the front door, always between her child and whatever existed beyond it. Her eyes never moved from Pip unless Marian moved too quickly. Then she would growl, low and primal. Not a threat, a warning. Pip slept mostly, his small form curled beneath the faded wedding quilt. But the flush had faded from his cheeks, and the tremble in his chest began to ease. He blinked at Marian once, his eyes wide and darker than hers had expected. He didn't smile, but he didn't flinch either. He reached out and touched the cabin floor with one hand, held it there, then touched his own chest like he was memorizing the feeling of warmth, of safety. By day 2, the firewood dwindled faster than Marian liked. She hadn't planned for this kind of draw, not with snow as deep as a man's thigh and winds that stripped bark from trees. She moved slower, saved energy where she could. When she chopped wood now, it was measured. Every swing exact, every breath precious. On day 3, Tessa came. The wind had nearly swallowed her whole, and by the time she pounded on the door, her hands were red to the wrist and her lashes clumped with ice. She dragged a wooden sled behind her, homemade, crooked but functional. Tied to it were 2 sacks: flour, dried beans, a cracked thermos of soup that had gone lukewarm halfway through the forest. Marian pulled her inside before she could fall. "You walked through that?" "You needed it," Tessa said, teeth chattering. "And I needed to know you were alive." Her eyes scanned the room, landed on the child, then on Maura. She froze, tried to speak, didn't. Her hand clutched the table edge. Marian stepped between them. "If you scream, he dies." Tessa's mouth opened, then closed. Her chin trembled, and then she nodded. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something. Later, they sat near the fire, the 3 of them. Marian stitched cloth beside the hearth. Tessa sorted lentils into an old pie tin, her fingers slower than usual. And Maura stayed near Pip, brushing his forehead with the same rhythmic tenderness Marian once reserved for her own. The silence inside wasn't awkward. It was thick, but not empty. It held the weight of understanding. That night, as they boiled broth and split it into equal shares, Tessa tried to help. She grabbed the lantern, fumbled near the wood stove, and knocked it sideways. The oil spilled fast. 1 splash, then 2. The fire caught it before either of them could move. The floor lit orange. Marian shouted. Tessa fell back, covering her face. Maura moved without a sound. She scooped Pip into her arms in a single motion and leapt to the far corner, shielding him with her own body. Her shoulders hunched, arms wide. Back to the heat. Marian grabbed a blanket, soaked it with snow from a bucket by the door, and beat down the flames. Her hands smoked. Her lungs burned. But it went out. The air turned black with soot and fear. Maura stayed crouched, her body curled around Pip like a cave of bone and fur. Marian sat down hard on the floor and coughed until her throat tore. Tessa didn't speak for a long time. When she did, her voice cracked. "I could have burned the whole place down." "You didn't." "But You didn't." That night Maura cried. Not loud, not ugly. She curled beside Pip, head bent low, and the tears slid in silence. Marian saw it from her chair. Just the shimmer of wet fur, the trembling in Maura's chest, the small heaving of breath held too long. Marian didn't move toward her. She just pulled her own chair closer to the fire. Let the flames speak for her. By the 4th day, Pip opened his eyes fully. He didn't smile, but he looked at Marian, at the fire, at Maura. He reached for the spoon with trembling fingers and let Marian feed him broth without a sound. His small hand brushed hers once, didn't pull away. Tessa watched from the corner, her expression unreadable. That evening, as they played cards by the window, Marian caught it. The smell. Not smoke from the stove, but cigarette smoke, old, faint, coming through the floorboards like a memory. Tessa smelled it too. She stiffened, whispered, "Dale." Maura lifted her head, her whole body tensed. She turned slowly toward the door and sniffed again. The growl that followed was different this time. Not protective, defensive, ready. Marian stood, pulled back the curtain. There was nothing there, only wind. But the smell lingered, and something in the air had changed. Tessa said, "He's close enough to smell us." Marian nodded, then moved to the table. She opened a small drawer, pulled out a tin of old flour, poured a handful into her palm and tossed it outside the back door. When the wind passed, they'd see footprints. She turned to Tessa. "We'll need to start making decisions." "What kind?" "On where we want the trail to lead if someone follows it." Tessa looked out at the snow, the way it drifted like ghosts across the porch. Then she nodded. On the 6th night, Maura didn't sleep. She paced, back and forth, back and forth. Her hands never left Pip, but her eyes never left the door. Marian laid out a map, not of roads, but of paths. Ones only she knew, places she'd buried old tools, landmarks no one used anymore. She taught Tessa how to mark fake prints, how to backtrack without leaving trace, how to speak with silence. On the 7th morning before the sun rose, Marian stepped to the window and froze. There, standing beyond the frost-glazed glass, was a man. Not moving, not searching, just counting. She knew it by the way his head turned. Slowly, deliberately, eyeing each window, each edge of the cabin. Like a predator marking points of weakness, she didn't call out. She stepped back. Tessa saw her face and went still. And behind them, Maura stood, taller than both of them. Her arms curled around Pip, her eyes already locked on the shape beyond the glass. She didn't breathe. She didn't blink. Just stared and waited. Dale Mercer didn't knock. He stood outside Marian's cabin like he'd been carved from the same frozen landscape. Boots planted deep in the snow, coat buttoned halfway up, the rest left open like he didn't feel cold the way normal men did. He wasn't there to talk. His silence stretched into something sharp. His eyes scanned the windows one by one, slow and calculating, as if each pane revealed a secret he already suspected. Inside, Marian didn't move. Not at first. She stood at the center of the room, one hand resting lightly on the back of the old kitchen chair, her breathing quiet but steady. Her heart beat hard enough she could feel it in her wrists. Across the room, Tessa gripped a chunk of firewood like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Maura had already stepped between the door and the hearth. Pip was behind her, curled beneath the quilt, too still to understand the shift in air. Maura didn't crouch this time. She didn't tremble. She stood tall, back straight, arms slightly bent, her massive frame blocking half the cabin like a living wall. They waited. Then came the sound. 3 short taps, barely more than the brush of knuckles against old wood. Polite. Performed. Then he tried the handle. It didn't budge. Of course it didn't. So he moved. Around the side. Snow crunching under boots that were too new, soles too clean for someone who belonged to this place. He passed the first window, then the second. Every few feet. He stopped, stared in. One hand resting casually on his belt, the other dangling like a snake preparing to strike. At the rear, he tested the back door. Still locked. Back inside, Tessa whispered, "He's looking for a reason." "He already thinks he has one," Marian said, voice low. The silence hung. Then the footsteps circled again. Then he spoke. "Marian?" his voice called, too cheerful, almost sing-song. "You all right in there?" She didn't answer. Storms passed, mostly. "Thought maybe you needed a hand with firewood, or whatever it is you've been hiding." Still no answer. A beat of quiet, then another knock, harder now. "You know," he said, voice dropping. "People talk, especially when a woman lives too long out here by herself, especially when there's tracks no one can name and sounds no one can explain." A pause. "You've got something in there, don't you?" Stillness. "Let me help," he said softly, pressing his face to the glass. Tessa moved then. She stepped forward, just once, planting herself square in front of the door. Not behind Marian, beside it. She raised the firewood higher. Dale saw her, smiled. "That you, Win girl? Heard you were stubborn. Didn't think you were stupid too." Tessa didn't flinch. He leaned closer to the glass. "You're protecting it, aren't you?" He stepped back. Then he reached into his coat, and from his pocket came a small bundle of kindling. Oily, dense. He struck a match. Let it burn for just a second, just long enough to flicker off his grin. Then he dropped it into the pile. Flames licked up like tongues. Marian stepped outside before he could take a second breath. She didn't speak. She moved through the snow with one purpose, coat unbuttoned, face bare. She crossed the few yards to the fire and stomped it out with both boots, her steps deliberate and slow. The match hissed. The flames died. She turned to face him. "You're done," she said. Dale tilted his head. "Done with what? Trying to help? Trying to protect what's left of common sense in this county? You're not protecting anything. I'm stopping a lie before it becomes a disease." She stepped forward again. "That thing inside saved a child's life. That thing," he hissed, "doesn't belong here. You don't get to decide what belongs. It's a beast, Marian. It kills, it hides. It doesn't pay taxes or follow rules or earn its place. It's not like us." She looked him straight in the eye. "It's better." He laughed, took a step back. His hand drifted near his belt again, where the hunting knife hung. Then a sound rose behind them. A creak. The cabin door. And then Maura stepped out. Not in rage. Not in fear. Just present. 9 feet tall. Covered in fur streaked with snow melt and ash. Her arms loose at her sides. Her shoulders wide as the doorway. Her eyes met Dale's and didn't blink. She didn't roar. She didn't snarl. She simply stood. That was enough. Dale froze. His whole body stiffened. The knife never left its sheath. His breath caught like a lung had collapsed. And in that moment, every scrap of predator left him. He stepped back once, twice. Then, shaking, he fired a shot. Not at her. Into the sky. The sound cracked through the woods like lightning splitting a tree. Echoed, then vanished. But it had done its job. From down the trail, a vehicle door slammed. Voices, a shout. Then a figure emerged through the low-hanging mist and snow-dusted trees. Deputy Calvin Rourke. He didn't draw his weapon. Didn't raise his voice. He took in the scene. Dale in the clearing. Marian at the smoldering fire. Maura near the doorway. Now already turning back inside. And he said loud enough to carry, "What in God's name are you doing, Dale?" Dale stammered. She's got it in there. You don't understand." Rourke didn't approach. "I saw you drop that match." "It's dangerous." "Are you?" Silence. "You have a permit for that weapon?" Dale didn't answer. Rourke stepped closer. "From what I can see," he said slowly, "there's been a storm, a few bad prints, and one man lighting fires where they don't belong. That's all I've seen." Dale opened his mouth, closed it. Rourke didn't flinch. "I'm going to ask you to leave this property. Now. And if I see you again with anything other than good intentions, I'll make sure you don't come back. Understood?" Dale looked to Marian, looked to the doorway. But whatever courage he'd carried into the woods had leaked out through his boots. He turned. Without a word, he walked back toward the trail. Rourke waited until the crunch of his boots had faded. Then he looked to Marian. "Everything okay here?" Marian nodded once. "I didn't see a thing," he said. He reached into the truck bed, pulled out a canvas bag, and dropped it at her feet. Flour, beans, and a chocolate bar if it didn't melt. He turned to leave. Didn't say goodbye. Didn't ask anything else. Just gave her that gift of silence and protection, the way men used to before words got in the way. Back inside, Tessa let the firewood drop from her hands. Maura was back by Pip's side, her body relaxed for the first time in days. Marian leaned against the door, breath coming slow, eyes still on the empty clearing. Tessa stepped forward, and without warning, wrapped her arms around Marian's waist, tight. Brief, then gone. They said nothing. The cabin was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. Now it was the quiet of something survived, something earned. Maura looked at Marian for a long time, long enough to say something without saying anything at all. And Marian, for once, didn't look away. The snow didn't melt all at once. It pulled back slowly, like a curtain someone wasn't quite ready to lift. First from the roofline, dripping steady as a metronome into the galvanized bucket Marian left by the stoop. Then from the deer trail that ran past the ridge, where earth showed in streaks of mud and pine needles, slick and thawing beneath the morning sun. The trees still held winter in their bones, but the light had changed. It came softer now, not as something to endure, but something that might, if you stood still long enough, feel like forgiveness. Inside the cabin, Marian stood over the kitchen sink, rinsing the last of the jars. Her hands ached, not from cold this time, but from use. Real use. The kind of tired that meant something had been built, cleaned, carried, not just survived, but shaped. Tessa sat at the table beside Pip, sorting dried beans into piles like it was serious business. She still didn't talk much, but the silence around her had changed. It no longer felt like a wall, more like a quiet forest, full of signs if you knew how to look. Pip wasn't coughing anymore. His color had returned weeks ago. And Maura, well, Maura hadn't left. She was still here. Not always inside, not always close, but never far. Marian could feel her even now. Not just in the tracks that circled the clearing or the bundle of dry spruce she left by the back door each morning, but in the way the birds came back, in the way the coyotes stayed away. Marian dried her hands and stepped outside. The morning was crisp, but not cruel. She didn't speak. She just stood, letting her eyes move past the trees, past the edge of the creek that now ran wild with meltwater. And there she was, Maura, upright, still, watching. Marian nodded once. That was all it took. The big creature stepped forward, slow and measured, crossing the snow-laced grass with a kind of grace that had nothing to do with size. She came to the edge of the porch but didn't climb it. Her eyes flicked to Marian's face, then to her hands. Then she offered something. A branch. Fresh pine, not snapped, peeled. But what mattered wasn't what it was. It was what was carved, right there along the grain. 3 shallow slashes beside one deeper groove, and a tiny curved notch near the top. Not a language Marian knew, but she understood. It was a mark, not of farewell, but of naming. She was being remembered. Maura let the branch rest at the edge of the step. Then she turned, and for the first time in weeks, walked beyond the clearing. Not fast, not like she was fleeing, but like something had ended. And something else, something just barely begun, had been entrusted. Marian didn't call after her, didn't follow. She just stood there, holding the air in her lungs, eyes fixed on the trail long after Maura had vanished between the trees. Later that afternoon, Tessa found her unpacking the cedar box, the one she hadn't touched in years. Inside were scraps, clippings, notes written in a tight, looping script. A few photographs, one of Marian and her brother in front of their father's old hunting shack, one of her mother holding a trout almost as big as her arm. And at the bottom, a small tin marked with rust. Inside the tin was a folded map, hand-drawn, years old. Marian spread it across the table. She hadn't looked at it since the accident, since the day she buried every question she ever had about the northern ridges and the things she thought she saw near Dead Elk Hollow. But now, she traced the familiar lines with one finger. The trail she used to hike in her 20s. The bend in the creek where her brother swore he saw something move upstream against the current. And then, the spot marked only with an X. Back then, it had meant nothing. Now it meant something else entirely. Tessa leaned in. "Where's that?" Marian didn't answer right away. But the next morning, she packed a bag. Not big, just enough. Dried food, bandages, a flask of clean water. One of the blankets Maura had pulled from the back shed weeks ago. She didn't say goodbye, didn't make a speech. She just told Tessa to keep the fire low, not to answer the door, and to trust her gut over any rule ever written. And then she left. not down the road, into the trees. The path hadn't been walked in years, but it was there. Sometimes that's all it takes. A path, a choice, and enough years behind you that you don't care how foolish it seems anymore. Marian moved slow, not because of her age, but because some places don't let you move fast. The woods here were thick with memory. Each step felt like part of something ancient. At the ridge, she paused, then kept going. It took her a day and a half to reach the glade. She knew it by the shape of the stones, by the stillness of the air, and by what waited in the center. They weren't all there. Not like some tribal council, not like a storybook. But there were signs, pine circles, carvings in bark that glinted faintly under the moss, bones placed in deliberate arcs. And then, off to the right, a figure stepped forward. Not Maura. Another, taller, grayer, older. His eyes were deep set, his face worn like a weathered cliff. But there was something in the way he regarded her. Not fear, not threat, recognition. He crouched, slow and easy, and placed one hand to the ground. Then, with the other, reached into a pouch slung across his side. What he pulled out looked like a rock at first, but when he held it up, it caught the light. Amber. A beetle trapped inside, perfectly preserved. He placed it at her feet. Marian didn't speak. She crouched, took the stone, and placed the pine branch Maura had given her in return. The old creature looked down at it, then nodded. That was the exchange. Not of power, not of proof, but of knowing. They stayed like that for what could have been minutes, or hours. Then Marian stood, and turned back. The walk home felt different, not lighter, but anchored, tethered to something that had been waiting for her to say yes. When she reached the cabin again, night had fallen. The windows glowed warm. Inside, Pip was asleep, head on Tessa's lap. She looked up, startled at first, then relieved. Marian hung her coat, walked to the sink, poured herself a glass of water, and when she turned back, she smiled. Not wide, just enough. Tessa stared for a moment, then finally asked, "Did you find what you were looking for?" Marian shook her head slowly. "No, but you're different." "I am." Silence again. Then Marian reached into her pocket, held out the amber. Tessa took it carefully, watched the insect frozen inside like a time capsule, then looked back up. "What does it mean?" Marian thought for a moment, then said softly, "It means there's more out there, and it's been watching longer than we've been looking." Outside, the wind had shifted, no longer biting, just moving, carrying something from one world to another. A branch swayed, a pine cone dropped, and somewhere far in the woods, a howl lifted. Not of threat, not of sorrow, but of recognition. A call not meant for ears, but for hearts that had learned at last how to listen. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest. Not because they were loud, not because they tried to impress, but because they reminded us, gently, honestly, that life is stitched together by the small mercies we offer one another, especially when no one is watching. This story was never really about monsters or myths. It was about the way we move through the world when no one owes us kindness, about how we choose to see the things others ignore, about the quiet strength of protecting something fragile, not because we're told to, but because our soul won't let us look away. At its heart, it was about boundaries, not the kind we draw to keep others out, but the kind we honor to let someone else belong. It asked a simple question. Can something wild and something human share the same ground, not by force, but by grace? And maybe more than anything, it was about how healing doesn't always arrive in the form we expect. Sometimes it comes wrapped in fur and silence. Sometimes it comes from facing the forest we've spent our whole life avoiding. And sometimes it walks beside us only for a while, but leaves a mark that never fades. The forest, in its own way, keeps track, not of names, but of choices, of who stepped forward when it mattered, of who stayed silent when it was easier to shout, of who returned something they could have claimed, and of who saw wonder, not just danger, in what they didn't understand. We live in a world that moves fast, that shouts over whispers, that often forgets the value of stillness and the language of presence. But some things, some truths, don't need volume to endure. They live quietly, like roots beneath the frost, waiting for someone gentle enough to notice, someone kind enough to tend them, and maybe, just maybe, the line between what is human and what is sacred is thinner than we think. If this story meant something to you, even just a little, thank you for listening. If it stirred a memory, or softened a thought, or reminded you of something you'd nearly forgotten, I'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment, share your thoughts. Tell someone else who believes in the power of quiet stories. And if you'd like to be part of the next one, subscribe to the channel, follow along. There are still so many voices waiting to be heard in the deep woods, because the forest hasn't stopped speaking. We just have to learn how to listen again.